We can start now, whenever you're ready. Okay, great, excellent. Thank you, everybody. Welcome to the regular Board of Education meeting, November 2nd. Just a quick housekeeping. In accordance with the requirements of the Open Public Meeting Act, Chapter 231, PL 1975 announcement, I wish to announce the New Jersey Open Public Meeting Law was enacted to ensure the right of the public to have advance notice of and to attend the meetings of public bodies at which any business affecting their interest is discussed or acted upon. In accordance with the provisions of this Act, the School Districts of the Chatham Board of Education has caused notice of this meeting to be published by having the date, time, place thereof posted in the Board Administrative Offices, sent to the clerks of the Chatham Borough, the Chatham Township, the Library of the Chathams, the Chatham Courier, the Daily Record, the Star Ledger, and the TAF, which is an online newspaper. Tatiana, are you going to be doing roll call? Very good, thank you.
Mr. Gilfillan. Mr. Arnott. Mr. Gorelli. Ms. Clark. Ms. Kenny. Here. Mr. Ryan. Here. Mr. Smith. Here. Mr. Valenti. Here. Ms. Weber.
Here.
6 present and accounted for.
Excellent, thank you. If you're able, please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. Just go with a virtual flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Didn't hear any of you. I didn't hear anybody. Excellent. Well, we have a big agenda, so I don't want to delay it any further. I know I see Mr. Mayor's up there. So Dr. LaSusa, I'll pass it right over to you and we can get right to it.
Thank you, Ms. Weber. Yes, and Mr. Mayor is joining us. He hasn't been here in a couple of years, I don't think, but he's going to give an overview of our social studies curriculum as it pertains to issues of race throughout American and world history and how we treat it as a department. Prior to getting to that, I just was going to mention that we're just about rounding the corner on 2 months of school at this point, which is great. I sent out a letter to staff and to parents last week, just letting them know how appreciative I was that we've been able to get this far, because even though it seems a distant memory, August and July and June weren't that far off, and at the time we were trying to figure out a way, a path forward, and how to get kids back in school and have students in person for school as long as possible. So it's a good thing that we've come this far. We want to go a lot further. But I also shared in my letter that obviously the cases in New Jersey are continuing to rise, and they are penetrating Chatham. At this point, we have kind of moved beyond that initial flurry of activity we had at Chatham High School in the beginning of the year, and after that, really, largely it was quiet for us, but in the past week or so, we've had additional cases, including 2 today, one at Washington Avenue School, probable, and one at Chatham High School, and that followed just on Thursday of last week, a case at Chatham Middle School. So in each instance, of course, we're conversing with the health department and we're following their guidance. We're helping them with the contact tracing process and following all of our protocols so that students or staff who may be a close contact of a person who tests positive are quarantining, and hopefully that way we will reduce any transmission or eliminate to the greatest extent we can the risk that someone contracts the virus in school. So we'll continue to do that, but at the same time there's an acknowledgement among a lot of the superintendents and school districts in New Jersey that we probably need to either update the guidance as it pertains to schools at this point, or come to an understanding that we might not be able to make it all the way through the school year without some kind of wider closure, just because the way the guidance reads, some of the factors that are taken into consideration with respect to school closure involve the level of transmission in a community or in the state, or in a region of the state, I should say. There are 4 levels of transmission: low, moderate, high, and very high, and we've moved from low to moderate, and some of our indicators in our region are pointing towards high. So first, that's a consideration that the Department of Health would take into account. And next, just the sheer number of cases in a particular school or school community also has an impact on whether or not schools remain open. So we're going to keep on moving forward. Schools as a default will remain open. And if we come to find from the Department of Health, based on whatever the conditions are in our community, that we need to change course, we will. I can report also that over the past 2 months, we've continued to make investments in our virtual, our set of resources to enable us to provide virtual instruction better than we did in the spring. We're surveying parents as we speak about their experience so far, their impression of how things have gone to this point in the year, and we'll continue to make adjustments and improvements so that we can hopefully deliver a better product on the virtual side if we're forced to go into all virtual mode at some point in the coming months. Lastly, I'll just mention that there are districts that are talking more and more about closing preemptively for some period of time, perhaps around the winter break. That's something that we can discuss in the future, but at the current time, now until Thanksgiving, shortly thereafter, at this point, our calendar remains in effect as it was, and we have a goal of remaining in person for students for as long as we can. Happy to take any questions.
Not so much a question, but this is after listening and watching the last couple of days in terms of some of these little pop-ups we had in our schools. I wonder how, you see where we are now, but I'm wondering what the thought process is and how we're actually going to work as a group to move forward and try to work with the state on a policy. And some of the things that I see is though the expectation is that a vaccine is a panacea, as though we're going to eradicate this disease as soon as we get a vaccine. And nothing could be farther from the truth. So, in the end, what it comes down to is a disease. Maybe if it's like past novel viruses that came after a year and just tweeted away. And we've seen that happen a lot in the past, but I don't know. So, if you look at it from the perspective of how our country works, right? We'll start this with the anti-vaxxers. Okay, we have a significant portion of this country who have lost faith in or don't believe in vaccinations. Right? I'm not so sure if that spreads all the way from vaccinations of kids all the way through the vaccines for a novel virus and the flu shot every year. But the numbers are pretty big. I've seen anywhere numbers from 15% up to 30% of people either who no longer will take vaccines or are starting to doubt vaccines as being effective. Now, if you go look at the flu shot, okay, the average hovers around 50%, around 60% for the 1 to 17-year-old group, so that's kind of our K through 12. There's been years that we have issues with our vaccines, and we've had low efficacy of the vaccines, and then we've had years that we guessed it right, and we've had pretty high numbers. So if you look at it from history of how vaccines are created, and this is very simplistic terms, it starts in South America, then we look at what goes on in south of the equator, and we take a guess as to what we should throw into our vaccines. And we've had years as low as only 45% of it was effective. So if we had a 50% people were willing to take a flu vaccine, and only 50% of that is effective, we have basically an effective vaccine rate of 25%. Loose numbers, but that's where it is. So my issue now is, what are we going to do moving forward? Because to me, we're at the point whereby we can't keep shutting down our schools if we have whatever the rules are in New Jersey. We are ignoring all the massive side effects that we have from the isolation that we're causing and issues surrounding, trying to combat this novel virus. And if I look at it, I'm not quite sure that this is going away. So where do we have to go from a policy perspective, from a financial perspective, a thought perspective, to look at this long term, because we're either going to have to live with it or we're going to be shackled by it for a long time. And if you look at it from the perspective of a policy, I don't believe we would be in a position whereby we can mandate the use of the vaccine in order for you to attend our schools. I don't know if the teachers union would approve that. I don't know what the profile of the teachers union looks like, nor do I know what the profile of people's parents or their grandparents are. So we have sat here and said it a million times, and we can't guarantee safety. We do our best, but we can't. So where are we going to be in September of next year if we could get this? Are we going to, what is it going to evolve to? Where are we supposed to be thinking about this from a long-term perspective? Because this can't go on forever. And I don't know how to unwind. I don't know the answer to this. But when you look at the numbers and start peeling them back, you understand either we need to be more aggressive in terms of how we are handling it and how we're going to handle it moving forward, or we sit back and do nothing. I don't like to sit back and do nothing. I think that we're doing the right thing now in terms of superintendents starting to reach out to other superintendents saying, hey guys, we see little evidence of in-school transmission. That's not just Chatham. That seems to be a relatively well-accepted fact now. But where is the time where either we push harder back on the state and say we need to change the rules here, or what is the time frame that we are here as a board need to start having the conversation, trying to make some decisions, trying to do things, to look at something that, the vaccine is not a cure-all. It is not. It's not what it is. But if you all seem to be waiting here for this vaccine to come, so how we're basing our future, this vaccine, when the vaccine is if it goes by historical numbers, maybe just because the people fear the danger of this disease versus other ones that they change their mind, but unfortunately the statistics don't tell me that. So I don't know what time frame it is. I think the mindset needs to be there. I think we need to be thinking about some of these policy perspectives now and how that policy flows down through the rest of the different committees on how we're going to be come April, May, September of next year. I don't think we can wait, but I do think, this is me talking, this is not anything from an opinion of the board, it's just me just trying to do some work on it and see where we're going. But I think we need to have a lot more conversations, and I think you need to have a lot more conversations with the superintendent and start talking to the state and saying this is where we are, this is where we feel we can start getting to in order to see where, what we can do to be better. I don't even know what better is, but so that was my hour of power lunch that I was thinking about this. But I'm amazed at the numbers that we really came down in the vaccine side and where we're headed. So I just want to have that out there. I want the board to know that that's kind of what's out there in terms of the numbers and what we're facing. And there might be a lot of times we have no power of it. We have no say from a policy perspective that we're going to mandate vaccines, and I'm sure we can. But I think we need to have just the mindset that, are we going to sit back and do nothing, or I like to say that, but are we going to sit there and understand this is a disease we probably have to learn to live with, and how we're going to do the best with it, and start trying to develop the policies surrounding that. Yes, with the most, of course, priority of keeping everybody safe, but kind of looking back at now, kind of a hand pot in some ways. And I don't know how to undo it. I don't know where we can take it, but I think that the mindset needs to be there to try to figure it out.
I just have a question. Irrespective of any vaccine or potential vaccine, what do you think possibly working out as far as policy? People continuing to die on a national scale.
If you look at the numbers, I didn't want to get into the past and the present in terms of where numbers are, because if you look at it from the perspective of what our rates are per day of positivity versus our hospitalizations, we're at about 12% of what we were at peak. So there's a lot of belief, and this is the oversimplifying a lot of things. This happens to be some work on it today. But there is the belief that we know we're doing a better job of how to handle this disease, right? And that the death rates have come down dramatically in terms of where they were. And I'm not an expert enough, because that's one thing I wanted to avoid, was kind of have that conversation about the hospitalizations and death, because I don't think I'm qualified enough to really honestly make a big opinion about it.
Exactly.
Right? So I don't really know. I don't want to belittle where we were and where we are now, or I don't want to act as though I might be cold and have lack of empathy for anyone who's unfortunately passed away. But we also have, and I've been doing this for a long time, but we have the I think of the right word here, we have the onus, unfortunately, on us as a Board of Education to start trying to push some things and thought initiatives in terms of where we are, where we're due to be, and how do we get there. And if that was with working with Mike in terms of him and his working with other superintendents saying, hey, the state, you've got us at A, but we think we can maybe go a little bit farther than that now. I see, to me, I think I don't want to bring in those statistics, but you hear them all the time in terms of what our drug use, our overdoses are, our suicide. There's all these different things, the side effects of everything that we've gone through. And I just don't understand how we get there. How is this going to unwind? What can we do to help it unwind? But we can't do anything. But when you look at the statistics in terms of what we thought was going to be the answer, it's not the answer. So we need to come up with ways to try to do our best to make it work. And I don't know what that is, but I wanted to kind of just bring all this stuff up so everyone can get the thought process of, what can we possibly do? What can our mindset be? Mike, you need to keep us up on what you're seeing out there in terms of what other superintendents are saying, what other experts are saying from the future of education. Because I don't think we can be this way, past this spring.
That's okay, I wasn't sure, but although, Matt, I think we have been, at least in committees and prior to starting this school year, we said that we don't believe, and I never want to say this out loud because I don't want to believe it, but we don't believe September 2021 is going to look vastly different than September 2020. So we think we're still going to be in this mode of, some alternate attendance. I know, Mike, we talked to superintendents, but if half the district closed and we think we can open, I think this board has said we want to do everything we possibly can to keep kids in school and whenever it's safe. I agree that the vaccine's not going to be the cure-all, but I think as a board we've already said we want to move forward as best we can when safe to keep kids in school for all those reasons you mentioned. Just like we are today, we're doing the best we can. There's numbers are going up, but we didn't close today because the numbers going up.
Well, okay, whatever. But that's one this is my thought process. I wanted to get it out there.
No.
I know we always we want to get it open, but
yeah, no. This is part of the dialogue.
I just
proactive.
To your point. I mean, I'm a pretty avid follower of the statistics and the news, and I don't see any majority of experts telling us that we're in an environment where we could safely open all our schools. I mean, if you've heard someone say that beyond one or two people, I'd like to know, but I have not heard that, which doesn't mean anything. So, to your point, right, I don't think anybody here is an expert on epidemiology. I think we're going to have to rely on people who know a lot more before we make a decision to take, I wouldn't say drastic, but make a change in policy. What do we base our decision making on? Well, yeah, I hear you, and I'm not.
I don't know. I just wanted to throw some things out there.
That's definitely part of the dialogue. But even this year, I don't know how many districts didn't open, but there's 40 some odd that still haven't opened. So I don't think, unfortunately, there's no, either fortunately or unfortunately, there was no mandate. It was figure it out, what's safe, what can you staff. I think Milburn High School still hasn't gone back. I don't think Livingston's gone back. And there's quite a few that haven't gone back, so.
What can we deviate like these big guidelines at all, or is it just we the kids that live and die, and the only decision is in person or online? That's the really only kind of decision districts have to make, or is there any flexibility in terms of what we can do? Or?
Well, I think there is flexibility within the state guidelines. I think one thing that many of us wish for is that the state's position since June at least, has largely been this will be a local decision. Every school district can do what it thinks best, with certain caveats and operating within the guidelines that the state issues. But there isn't a state stance necessarily. So, and we've talked about some of this before, but leading up to this school year, you know, back in the summer, back in May, there were countries that were making decisions like all elementary kids are going to go to school. All high schools are going to remain virtual. I'm not saying that that's the right approach, but there were countries that made those types of definitive determinations. In Europe right now, as Ms. Kenny has been emailing me an article or two each week, there are many countries that are reimposing lockdowns similar to those that were in place in the spring, with one notable exception, and that has been that the schools have remained open, even though other businesses and other entities in society have closed. That's a stance that those countries are taking because they feel in many cases that the downsides and the consequences to having schools closed are very significant, and they want to do whatever they can to keep them open, even though they're registering 200,000 cases a day in Europe. So that is something that I would say we lack for the most part in New Jersey. In New Jersey, the guidelines have been one of flexibility. It's flexibility based on the school district, and for that reason, we have scores of districts that still have not opened, some of which have already announced they're not going to open in 2020, and it won't be before January or February when they do open. You have other districts that are in a hybrid model. You have other districts that have all their kids in. You have other districts where some of the schools are open, but some of them remain closed. So you've got this whole, you know, big range of different models. And you know, it may be time for New Jersey just to update its guidance one way or the other. I mean, it might be that New Jersey says this winter's looking terrible, the cases are skyrocketing, hospitalizations are going up, even though they're a fraction of what they were back in March or April and May, but we're gonna shut it down between Thanksgiving and New Year's. Or New Jersey might say we're gonna go the way Europe is going, and we really believe schools should stay open no matter what because they're so vital in the lives of kids. But those are all decisions that are really beyond our pay grade, and ones that we just have to operate within whatever the rules are that they provide us. Your other questions are, you know, they're way above my pay grade too. I don't know, you know, what's going to happen 6 months from now in terms of vaccines or therapeutics, or whether New Jersey mandates that some of us have to get vaccines if we want to work in a public setting. I don't know any of that. That's all, you know, just guesswork at this point. But of course, I agree with you that it's unlikely that we're going to wake up on June 1st or March 1st or September 1st and COVID isn't going to be here, and we're not going to have to worry about it or take some of the same types of precautions that we've been taking. It's going to be a long, you know, it's going to be a long road probably.
I just wanted to add also that what Matt said, I do, in a sense, agree with what he was trying to say. I think you hit the nail on the head with your commentary. I think it was this week that you said anyone expecting us to get back to where we were before, it's not going to happen, right? So at what point do we get to this whole thing when the consensus that there's going to be a cure doesn't happen, and it's still around, and now they're 1 year, 2 year, 3 years down the road? Do we have to weigh sacrificing the child and their experience and their growth with all the other things that Matt mentioned? I get it. It's a hard decision.
Yeah, and of course, it's staffing and the needs of the staff members, the protection of the staff members is right alongside what's happening with students. And I know other superintendents who lost faculty members last year. I talked with another person over this weekend who's got a staff member right now who's hospitalized. So it's, of course, there is weighing what's going on in the lives of students, but it's also being able to provide as much safety, and nothing's perfect, like you said, Matt. You can't guarantee everything, but we have to provide as much safety as we can for staff members. And that's hard to do in a people-centric business where you've got hundreds of bodies congregated in a school building. Even with the types of measures we're taking, there's still risk there that has to be factored into the equation.
That goes back in our mind with the policy side of it. You know, do we have to mandate that all teachers and staff get a vaccine? That's again, nothing to think about. How far up the food chain do we go in terms of mandates? I don't know. I don't know the answer, but that is something we're probably going to be thinking about.
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, to date, the Department of Health or the state of New Jersey determines what vaccinations and what kind of physical, examination a staff member must go through, or a student for that matter. All of that is laid out for us by the Department of Health. And then we have no choice. We have to adhere to whatever the Department of Health determines. But, like you said, vaccination is a hot button issue. None of us knows I don't know anything about the potential COVID-19 vaccine that might come on the market at some point down the road. So your guess is as good. You know more than I do about what might be lying ahead in that regard.
So more to follow on this.
But one thing I can say at the present time, and this does, I was on the phone with the superintendent on my way in, who was talking about just using the color-coded matrix that is determining transmission rate to kind of help guide whether or not we should become more aggressive, pull back, or remain status quo. And his thinking was, if you're in the orange or the red, you don't want to become more aggressive, that's for sure, because it means that the transmission is high or very high. If you're in the green, which is where we were when the school year began, and for the entire month of September, it means you can ramp up and you can push a little. And if you're in the yellow, you should probably just hold and stay put. So right now we're in the yellow. I think this is the second or third week we've been in the yellow. And we'll see what the coming weeks yield in there. I don't know, but I do think that I had been getting a fair number of inquiries from parents about when are we going to bring kids in either more often or for a longer day. I don't think that at the current time we're in a position where we should be doing that just yet. And if things stabilize and we go back towards the green over the next month, then I would rethink that. But at the current time, I wouldn't feel comfortable recommending that we alter the structure of school given what's happening regionally.
Can you just remind me what the absolute rule is now? If it's how many kids you have to close down the school for a certain amount of time? What are those? Can you just remind me of those rules again?
I couldn't just go through them quickly because there's a whole matrix, and all of that has to be determined by the Department of Health, and there are a lot of things that they take into consideration before advising one way or the other.
Pretty much two unrelated events in a building, and that building can be shut down.
I couldn't hear you, Mike. I don't know if you're able to hear that.
It's my understanding of the guidelines from reading it in the policy committee is that it's two unrelated events. So two cases that are unrelated to each other can be determined to be some kind of a spread that we need to act upon, and at least shutting down that particular building. There's not a lot of room.
I'm sorry, Mike.
There's not a lot of room that we have to play with.
No, and I think a lot of it's going to be a game day decision, depending on what you're looking at that particular day. I get your point, Matt, that we need to look forward to what does September look like as well. But a lot of these decisions will be dictated for the superintendent by the Board of Health. That's not to say that we can't plan for September 21, because I don't think it's going to look vastly different than this September. I think we still will need to prepare and take the safety precautions. And I agree, Mike, if it doesn't work for the staff, it doesn't work. It's a teaching environment. It's an instructional environment. So we have to make sure it works for the teachers as well as the students. And
I would, Matt, and I respect, just to be clear, I respect your train of thought. And theoretically, I think we would all want to try to look forward to September, just as we're trying to do in our respective businesses and personal lives and, beyond our families and the broader economy. But we're buying time until we know more, until we understand more as a nation, I believe. And nobody has a crystal ball. and nobody knows what's going to happen in September, to include the experts, as they've said time and time again across the board. So I don't think that, I just don't think that we could look that far out and have or come to a decision that has any kind of real efficacy. And I think that if we have a choice of being cautious, or trying to predict the future, for lack of a better word, and I know that's not what you're trying to say, that we should be cautious.
Prepared. I want to be prepared.
I'm also,
Well, the mindset is not so much.
We all want to be prepared, but again, we don't have a crystal ball, so we all want to be prepared. So
Well, the mindset is not so much that, it's more, okay, Mike said, two unrelated events, we have to shut the school. Are we at that point whereby we can ask, you can say, that's not really the right thing to do. Two unrelated events, is it the right time to shut down the school? Should the numbers be at a higher level to shut the school down? Or should the numbers be more focused on identifying and contact tracing and isolation? That's what I'm asking for, not so much the cautious side of it, but are there rules in place right now that we basically can say, they're ineffective, they're onerous, they're not helping? Do we have enough evidence yet in order to start looking at some of the rules that are placed upon us and start pushing back and saying, we need to ask for, is it 12 unrelated events, or is it 6 is the right number? So it's not so much, 100% or 0%, it's more of what's been passed upon us. Is it time? Do we have enough evidence? Do we have anything that we can say, no, we're not going to close schools after 2 kids get it. We think we've got a better plan or a different plan that works because the transmission is very low in school. So it's more based around, that kind of stuff than, me picking a number out of the air and saying, it's the right time to blow our masks off and move forward.
I hear exactly what you're saying. I was on an NJSA legislative committee call this morning, and that one of the issues that some folks raised was, should there be more proportionality in the rule for shutting down? So if you have a school with an total enrollment of 67 students, and that school has 2 cases of COVID spaced 8 days apart, and you have another school that has an enrollment of 2,400 with 2 cases of COVID spaced 8 days apart, is that the same thing? And the way the guidance document reads now, that may be considered the same thing. That might be vastly different, and there should be, at least the folks on this call were arguing that there should be, now that we've lived 2 months of school, and these guidance rules came out in August when transmission was low, no one had opened a school building yet, we didn't have as much information as we have now. Should something like that be revisited so that there are just other factors that are taken into account instead of simply 2 cases within 14 days means this, regardless of the setting. So I think you're right. I understand exactly what you're saying, Matt, and I think it would be beneficial for the Department of Health to do some updating and revising, just based on the fact, if nothing else, then we've got 2 months under our belts now in our state, plus the experience of other states and other countries, which in August or July hadn't been the same as it is today. That would be helpful to us. And we're working on that.
Dr. Lasita, is there any guidance in the guidelines that could suggest that 2 unrelated cases that have not been proven to be transmitted in the school building itself, that those kind of don't count toward the guidelines?
It's interesting you asked.
You understand my question?
It's a great question, because my understanding is different health departments may be interpreting that differently, and that there are some schools that have been closing if the cases are unrelated, and there are others who are not closing necessarily because the Department of Health is saying, no, we understand the source of this case, we understand the source of this case over here, it's not indicative of widespread community transmission, and we don't see a reason for you to close. But that, of course, is concerning to superintendents, because we all would like to have the exact same set of determinants on whether or not schools are closed or open. So that's something that we've kind of asked for clarification about, because that document is confusing a little bit when you go through the matrix. And our position, of course, and you know, my position has been, well, I'll defer to the departments of health. I'll give them all the information they need, and what they tell us we should do, given this is a public health crisis, is what we'll do. But you are spot on in your question, Mike. It's one that's being asked a lot.
So Mike, do I understand correctly that you are talking to other superintendents and that policy issue is being discussed, that you're trying to...
A number of policy issues are being discussed, yep.
So is your intention to go to the state and ask them to look at these policies? I mean, I just want to clarify to make sure that, you know, we're, you know, addressing Matt's question.
Yes, so
collectively.
I'm tied into two different groups. One is the Garden State Coalition of Schools that represents districts like ours. The other is the ASA. And yes, they are then meeting with, like there was one meeting today, this afternoon, with folks from the governor's office, or folks in the legislature, or folks in the commissioner's office. So that is what's happening with lots of issues that we're discussing now.
Got it. Thank you.
If there are no other questions, then I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Mayor, who will do kind of the second half of the curriculum visit that Ms. Heather Rocco started a couple of weeks ago. So, Mr. Mayor, it's all yours.
Again, just as a reminder, this is the second half of the curriculum review that we talked about in July, August, September. We had just asked for time to get the schools up and running and get some ground under our feet. So this is the second half. So I'm hoping that Mr. Connors is going to tell me that there's 300 or 400 people watching online on the. So no, he's saying no, it's not the case. Okay, Steve, I just wanted to let everybody know that this was the second half of that curriculum that we had talked about over the summer. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening. I'd like to thank the board for the chance to talk about social studies tonight. I always appreciate the chance to talk about social studies and history at board meetings. I like to talk about social studies and history at any meeting, or in a classroom, or in a grocery store, or on the checkout line. Doesn't make me too popular. I guess it's altogether fitting that we have a social studies presentation the night before a presidential election. Although 90 million people have already voted, I know this couldn't have been planned, and I have to tell you that I appreciate the coincidence. I'd like to thank the members of the community who came out here tonight, as well as everyone who might be watching the live stream or who will be watching the recording later. And I want to say a special thank you to the students who are watching on the live stream, who've been attending board meetings since April. It's a Monday night, and they don't have school tomorrow, but they're still following this issue, because they want to play a role in what happens in the schools, and they want their voice to be heard. The students who have started us in this conversation are a wonderful example to others, and they make their social studies teachers proud. Our lessons mean nothing if they are not acted on. There is little question that tonight we are at a pivotal point in our nation's history. With more than 230,000 Americans dead over the past 9 months, we are facing personal loss on an epic scale. And with it, social and economic cataclysm that's almost impossible to comprehend. The pandemic has uncovered and laid bare inequalities and shortcomings in our society that most of us haven't noticed for years. And it has warped our sense of time and space, so much so that it seems like it was years ago that the murder of George Floyd blazed across our screens and ripped into our hearts. Yet another name was added to a list that already included Breonna Taylor, Freddie Gray, Eric Garner, alongside other names that are fading in our collective memories, like Medgar Evers, Emmett Till, Vernon Dahmer, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Mickey Schwimmer, and countless others deeper in the past who never had their own names to begin with. So when students signed this petition and brought it to the board, they were making a direct statement, like many others in their generation are doing with climate change and school violence. They wanted to do something about their world, and this was the place to start. The challenge for social studies, specifically, is that there are many, many demands made on our curriculum. And this is why. Our country is unique in the fact that it is based on an idea, and we are always wrestling with the parts of that idea that are timeless and the parts of that idea that should never change, and the parts of that idea that must change and develop over time. Our public education system contributes much to the definition of just what that idea is and what it means. So the standards and state policies, the local curricula, and even a teacher's assigned readings at night all contribute to what we are teaching our young people about ourselves. So the question we are all facing is, how are we, as a people, going to understand our past? This question is harder to confront, but more important to answer in the midst of a crisis. So it makes sense that our students and the community would voice their concerns now, just as other groups are doing in other districts across the state. This is part of a national discussion about history education that you can see in the controversies over the 1619 Project and the President's 1776 Commission. But as we have that conversation ourselves, right here in our house, we have to look forward to the future to bring equity to our district, and we have to acknowledge that our work goes beyond just what is taught in social studies in ELA. It includes efforts across the school district and the community of the borough and the township, as well as the state and the country as a whole. Now, what I can do in this whole process, and what I hope to do tonight, is to take you on a very quick journey through social studies lessons from kindergarten through 12th grade. And as much as I want to show you so much of what we are doing and what we have been doing with regards to racial and social justice, how we are doing it and what we hope to accomplish in the process. Now, even though there's a lot of material here, and as much as I want to boast that we've been doing this for years, we still have a long way to go. What we teach is important, but it's not as important as what students actually learn. What we talk about in terms of racial and social justice in meetings like this is important, but it's not as important by how we act and what we say when we're not in meetings like this. I am privileged to work with some of the best social studies teachers in the country, and this is just a brief glimpse into their work as creative, and committed education professionals. Any conversation about what we teach has to start with the standards. As public educators, we have to operate within the student learning standards, the law and policy of the state of New Jersey, and for us in social studies, we've had 3 iterations of standards since 2009, the latest of which is going to affect next year. We have 3 main standards in U.S. history, world history, and active citizenship, and then we have 4 disciplinary concepts in civics, economics, geography, and history. We have 6 social studies practices, and on top of that, we have 400 cumulative progress indicators with benchmarks at 2nd, 5th, 8th, and 12th grade. Now, in New Jersey, if you want to build a house, you can build any house you want, but it has to be within the building code of the locality and the state. The same is with our curriculum with respect to the student learning standards. We can customize our curriculum for our district and our students, but it has to be within the code. Still, more often than not, we think of these standards as a minimum, not a maximum. Now, although the latest iteration of the student learning standards has a finer definition of what the concepts are, and they stress skills more than they have in the past, the most consequential change in state policy is found in the LGBTQ mandate. New Jersey is one of only 5 states in the country that mandate that, quote, all disciplines include instruction on the political, economic, and social contributions of persons with disabilities and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people in an appropriate place in the curriculum in middle and high school students. Now, there are many analogies that you can use to show how it is that we develop lesson plans and learning experiences, and I'm going to try weaving here. What's the best content to illustrate a concept and exercise a skill? On the left, you see the disciplinary concepts from the standards and just a snapshot of the few disciplinary concepts we have in Chatham, and racial and social justice are just one of several. But in order for us to develop lesson plans, what we're trying to do is find the best content that catalyzes the concepts and the skills. There is no end to the content that we have available to choose from, and we're always looking for the perfect combination. Is there a map that we can combine with a book excerpt and public data that allows students to use evidence to make a defensible claim about racism? Keep in mind we're doing this for all objectives and skills, and we're doing this on a continual basis to experiment with lesson plans and with resources to find the best combination of each to teach essential understandings. Social studies is the science of exploring people's lives, how they live as individuals and in groups. And what I'm going to show you is just a snapshot of what we're doing right now in classrooms. It's not near everything that we do. Some of the lessons you're going to see have been around here for 10 years, some are just brand new. Not every student gets every lesson. They are edited and modified and customized for particular student groups, for particular ages, and for particular classes. But when we put together our first 3 years of social studies, what we're dealing with is 6-year-olds whose world is their family and their school. And we have them immerse themselves in looking at how their family and school is different than others, how they are alike and how they're different. In second grade, we expand that bubble a little bit and look at children around the world. In third grade, we meet some of the standards requirements in terms of teaching about New Jersey, but in a unit on growth and change in New Jersey, we can deal with different diversity in communities in New Jersey and the immigration experience. I'm just going to show you just one example of a resource that we use in second grade. What would it be like to walk through any home in the world? Not just to see a family portrait, but to look at their furniture, where they eat, where they sleep, what their pets are. This is Dollar Street. It's a project of Ann Rosling, who was working with trying to make public data accessible to people and found out the charts didn't work, but 44,000 photographs could. So with this resource, a student can look at the lives of a family of 5 living on $20 a month in Burundi and compare it to a family of 2 living on $19,000 a month in Paris. This is effective not only for showing the disparity of wealth between countries, but wealth within countries. We have students get to these families with a map, and they'll see that in a neighborhood in Colorado outside of Denver, there's one family of 2 living on just $600 a month, and that is that child's most favorite thing. And compare that to a child that's living in a suburb of Seattle with a family that's making $3,000 a month. I can't promise that students internalize what they're seeing here, but they are recognizing a difference in how they are the same as these children because they have something that's special, what's their favorite toy, but also how different their experience is. It's at 4th grade that students get into social studies as a specific discipline. And we introduce them to the science of social studies by looking through the eyes of an economist, an historian, a geographer, and a political scientist. So after students understand what these people do in the first unit, we then go on a regional tour through the United States. In each region, we get into the geography, the landmarks of the region, a little bit about the culture. And then we get into current events or events in the past that allow us to show what a geographer and a political scientist, an historian, and economist can really do. So there'll be a lesson on the Erie Canal in the Northeast, where we'll deal with the economics and the geography of it and the changes that made to the culture of New York City. We'll deal with agribusiness in the Midwest. There's a lesson in the Southwest that deals with water management and the water crisis that they are going through today. When we get to the Southeast, that's where we'll focus on history. And the reason it's in this presentation tonight is to show you how we confront 10-year-olds with segregation. In this lesson. It's drawn from resources from iCivics, which has been around since 2008. It was founded by Sandra Day O'Connor as a way to make high-quality materials for the teaching of civics. Students are given what is called a document-based question. What we do is we provide them with historical evidence and primary sources, pictures and signs from a segregated theater and restrooms, but also laws that deal with segregation in terms of marriage and with sports teams playing against each other. What the student's task is to look through these materials and to categorize them. What part of society are they segregating? And in the process, students are going to understand the totality of that system. So you'll notice at the bottom they're being asked for their reaction to these laws and what they think the purpose was. In order to be able to work towards desegregation, students have to understand the history and background of where segregation was and how it started and where it operated. And I've been in these classrooms for these lessons. It is very difficult for a 10-year-old to understand segregation. It is even harder for a fourth grade teacher to explain it, because they're put in the role of explaining why this was done. So some of our work in the future, as we think about professional development and where we have to go, part of it is arming teachers with the sort of professional development, the skills, the background, and the knowledge of what professionals know about this and what psychologists know about this is the best way to approach that sort of instruction. This lesson is about 4 or 5 years old, still being done today, but as it has been successful and teachers got more comfortable in navigating it, several teachers added lessons onto it. The one on the right is a teacher who provided students with an age-appropriate reading comparing the March on Washington in 1963 to the March on Washington in 2017. This opened students' eyes to the persistence of this situation and the way it is continuing across time. That picture of Martin Luther King, the I Have a Dream speech in that March on Washington, is one of the most iconic moments in American history. If you look at test results for years across the country, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and the I Have a Dream speech. It's universally known. Because of that, the students' understanding of it, whatever Martin Luther King lessons they received in years before, what they hear about in other lessons, is an understanding of it as nothing but positive, for obvious reasons. But what we also do is provide them with a newspaper article from the time period, from 1963, to see that at that time, not everyone thought that his message was positive. Some people saw him as a troublemaker. Some people saw him as the source of the problem. And to provide students with that glimpse into it at fourth grade, just to show the subtle differences between how it's understood, is worthwhile. In fifth grade, students have an entire year of U.S. history. By doing this, we meet the standards of New Jersey's student learning standards through 8th grade. And the reason I'm highlighting that is because this change was made just about 9 years ago. Before we made that change, students had some U.S. history in 3rd grade, they had some U.S. history in 5th grade, they had some U.S. history in 7th grade, and then in 9th grade, and then in 10th grade. By putting this course here in 5th grade and covering all the standards through 8th grade, that allowed us to put the 7th grade course into our scope and sequence. The 7th grade course is World Cultures and Geography. You may have heard of that course. The textbook that we use for this is from the Teachers Curriculum Institute, TCI, and we bought that about 7 years ago and have been using it ever since. That textbook is from a company that is started by social studies teachers. It's not one of the bigger publishing houses, and they stress active experiential learning. And that book has a chapter alone on facing slavery. What that chapter does is the students may have heard of slavery before, they may have some idea of it, but what it does is it shifts their view of an enslaved African and it puts it through their eyes. What is the dilemma that they face? What was capture like? What was transport like? What was life in the colonies? And this gives them an age-appropriate understanding of what the system of slavery was like. And I have to point out here that we could be proud that we put slavery into the hands of fifth graders, and we're confronting them, including it as part of their U.S. history instruction, and that we did it 7 years ago. We were ahead of the curve. But as much as we can be proud of that, the first students, whoever had that chapter, just graduated in 2020. Anyone who graduated before then never had this textbook, never had that chapter. Now, as teachers became comfortable with this, and as we were able to learn about teaching it better, we started to incorporate resources from Stanford's History Education Group. This is a group of research and development group in education led by Sam Weinberg. They're some of the most well-respected educators in the country in terms of teaching students how to do history. They produce their products, they test them, and then they modify them on the results of how well they do. And what we're doing with students here is they've read the textbook about the Middle Passage. Now they're going to read historical documents from that period. For those who are not aware, the Middle Passage is the name that historians have used to define the passage of Africans who were captured in Africa and taken across the Atlantic Ocean to North and South America. We know that somewhere between 12.5 and 12.7 million Africans were taken across the Atlantic, and only about 10.5 million of them actually survived. And the reason we know that is 20 years worth of research and digitization of the ship's logs, of banking records, of insurance company records. We have the data. That's the difference of teaching history now as it was to teaching history 20 years ago. So what we do is we take students and put them in the position of an historian. They read our textbook about it. Let's read a paragraph from a Portuguese textbook written in 1994. Let's read a paragraph of a ship's captain's log. What did he say about it? Now, that language in that document has been modified. It's made appropriate for a fifth grader, and it's made possible for a fifth grader to understand it. Although it's going to take maybe a little extra time, it's worth it, because what students are doing in this process is they're reconciling different sources of information. What did the captain say as opposed to a doctor? What did the doctor say as opposed to a former slave who was on one of these boats? They're reconciling different sources of information, they're accounting for perspective and bias, and they're trying to come to an understanding. Anyone who goes home tonight and scrolls through the news on their phone, guess what you're going to be doing? You're going to be reconciling different sources, you're going to be accounting for perspective and bias, and you're going to try to come to an understanding. One last note about this, the pictures that you're looking at just shows you how we're always trying to give students an understanding of something they don't understand with something that they do understand. Most of these students might have an experience of understanding what a luxury airliner looks like. And we use that as a way to show how different it is on a slave ship. That U.S. history course also exposes students to this is in fifth grade, they're exposed to the forced expulsion of 60,000 Native Americans from eastern states to Oklahoma. There's a description of it in the textbook. We might look for a short video from an acceptable source that's appropriate for their age to illustrate it for them. They might look at a couple paintings, and then we'll put primary source documents. And the reason I included in this example is a very subtle lesson in this that you won't recognize until you're in a fifth grade classroom with those kids, because they'll point at Chief John Ross and say unequivocally without a filter, he's not an Indian. Look at him. And that allows us to start impressing on their minds at fifth grade the subtle differences between groups of people. They won't understand the word assimilation, but they'll understand the process of assimilation and the fact that this is a Native American just like the others in his tribe, but he has a different view on what's happening. It gives them the idea, it teaches them that not all of one group is the same. When students get to the middle school, they go through these three courses, and I want to just talk briefly about the World Civilizations course. The teachers there just pioneered a young adult historical fiction novel, The Golden Bull, just last year, and it follows the story of two teenagers in Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago during a famine when their father sent them into the city of Ur. They have a short experience of slavery, but what's more important about that book is it shows them the stratification of Mesopotamian society and the different gender roles. What happens to the girl is very different than what happens with the boy. Of course, world cultures and geography, we're taking students to give them a more global understanding of what's happening in the world. And not only it's a geography course, so we'll first deal with the geography of each region of the world, but then with the second half of each unit, there are authentic current event projects. Students are exposed to the civil war in Syria in the past, to the water crisis in sub-Saharan Africa. The 8th grade course is nothing but civics for an entire year. There are not many school systems that can have a full course in world cultures and geography at 7 and a full year of civics at 8th grade, and we do that because of the 5th grade U.S. history. That has an entire unit on the Constitution. And most importantly for us now is that unit on civics literacy that deals with information literacy and being able to understand whether something is true or not and how to find corroboration for it, to give them the schools, the skills to navigate the information environment that we're all living in. They also have at 8th grade a cycle class that focuses specifically on Holocaust studies and human behavior. When that course was first developed, the resources that were used the most were from Facing History and Ourselves, which is one of the most respected organizations in dealing with education in this area. And they deal with concepts like identity and membership and individuals and groups, and that course has been able to build on that foundation and get better year after year. It's in the high school that we get to our big history courses with U.S. History 1, U.S. History 2, and World Studies. What we're trying to do in teaching students history is to help them to tolerate complexity, to adapt to new situations, and to resist the first answer that comes to their mind. And they can do this by us teaching them how to read, reason, and write within the discipline of history. History and the past are two different things. The past is everything that happened up until this moment, everything. But history is the discipline of trying to draw understandings of the past. The terms are conflated all of the time, but by understanding the difference between the past and history, students can better navigate what that history is. Now, I included the other courses on this slide just to let you know the breadth of what we offer. And those semester electives down there, it used to include an African American Studies course. Now, through 2009, 2010, 2011, by 2012, the student interest in that course started to wane. And there's only so many electives that we can offer. And at that point, we started to get to the point of offering AP World History, AP Seminar, AP Research, and AP Economics, which now have many sections. So maybe we'll look to the future on how those semester electives can change, but what we're dealing with and trying to get students to enroll in semesters is the attraction of those AP courses. If you went to school in the last century, and for many, many students across the country still today, you learned history from one textbook, watered down and made acceptable to the purchasing committees of California, Texas, and Florida. That's the way that industry works. We have a textbook in the social studies office here at the high school that was published in 1983. It was the book that I had when I went to high school. It's titled American Pageant, written by Thomas Bailey. You can look through that book and you won't find any mention of the internment of Japanese by the United States government during World War II. The Nisei are not in that book. It's as if it didn't happen. So even though the Nisei are now in history books today, you can only think what else is being left out. This is one of the reasons that we've moved our history course away from just one resource more than a decade ago. Because there's not one history. There are histories. It's not singular, it's plural. Now, the arguments over what to include and what not to include have been going on for a century, but there's one very important difference that we face today, and that is that none of these arguments ever had to deal with the access to historical evidence that we have now. There are letters, journals, documents, maps, telegrams, receipts, birth and death records. There are biological, epidemiological, archaeological evidence, and they are all being digitized, sliced, diced, and algorithmed in every way possible. This historical evidence is searchable, reorganizable, and easily made visible. So the task of defining who we are as a collective is much more difficult because who we are as individuals is so much more tangible. To understand what a history teacher is going through today, imagine a scientist working on a project for years and having someone bust into the lab and drop 2,000 years worth of lab results on their desk all at once. That's why we approach our instructional planning from drawing on the two columns to the right. We use materials from many different histories while teaching students how histories are made. This is the secret sauce of instruction that gives our students a better understanding of the past and how to learn more about it. And better yet, how to navigate their adult lives when they'll drown in information unless we give them the tools to swim. So when we teach U.S. History 1 and U.S. History 2, all of our instruction is based on a course essential question. What is it that Americans need to understand about their past to make sense of their present? This has been the centerpiece of those two courses for 2 years, and it defines the circle that we keep going through as we deal with these materials. Is it important to ask this question of the past? Where do we look for answers about this question of the past? And how can we know that those answers are worth looking for and can be trusted? These are just some of the resources that we use to expose students to issues in racial and social justice in U.S. history. This first is from a documentary film made in 2003. As part of the New Deal programs introduced by FDR during the Great Depression, there was a federal writers project. And for 2 years, they interviewed more than 2,000 people who were slaves as children. And these interviews were typed, and then they were microfilmed later. And in 2003, a producer got a hold of them and then got actors like Sam Jackson, Oprah Winfrey, Whoopi Goldberg, Dan Cheadle, Vanessa Williams, and had them read them. And the reason this is valuable for teaching is because it goes beyond the basic stuff that we know about slavery. Sure, it deals with brutality. Sure, it deals with torture and abuse. Sure, it deals with the way in which lives were completely stolen. But it also has within it how people made lives within that system. So as the lesson, students don't just drink this in and move on. We use that to develop the skills of an historian. What's the origin of this source? What's the purpose of it? And most importantly, what's the value and what are the limitations of this source and understanding about the past? George Washington's ownership of enslaved Africans is one of those topics that you couldn't find in high school history books for years. And you also couldn't find out much about it in any public depiction of history. There was little of George Washington's slaves found at Mount Vernon or other museums across the country, but that's not the case today. And that's why we're immersing students in that change and our collective understanding through looking at a number of primary source documents made available by Mount Vernon, including his will, his journals, his letters. And what students are doing here is they're reading first a New York Times article that talks about the way U.S. history textbooks from different states are dealing with this issue. And then they read another newspaper article from 1974 from West Virginia in which this disagreement over what's included in textbooks shut the schools down. It's important to note that this lesson is not taught in isolation. George Washington's remarkable achievements remain in our class. It's his leadership in the Revolutionary War, but most importantly, the manner in which he gave life to the office of the presidency and filling in what the Constitution didn't prescribe. But we still are including stuff that's now in the public understanding of George Washington's slave. If you go to the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, if you look across the street, you'll see the foundations of George Washington's house. That is made another museum. The names of his slaves were written in the wall there, and if you look closely on the sidewalk, you'll see bare feet. Looks like a kid ran across the wet cement. Those bare feet were put there on purpose to signify Ona Judge, one of the slaves who escaped from George Washington, who we know about because she was interviewed when she was in her 40s by a New Hampshire newspaper reporter, and she had waited that long because she didn't want to tell anybody else until the people who had helped her escape had actually passed away. The reason I include that is to let you know that this lesson is consistent with a public understanding and wrestling with the story over time of how we deal with our past. Of course, we have lessons on the expansion of slavery in U.S. history, but we're also looking at the statistics of the amount of money that was made, the role it played in our economy in the North and the South, the percentage of the Bank of the United States holdings that could be traceable to slavery, and we're also exposing students to the arguments used by people who defended this system, how they used the Bible to defend slavery, how they said that it was a positive good. When we deal with the women's rights movement in the 19th century, we make connections to what's happening today. We also put students in a role play that has them act out a meeting of the Anti-Slavery Society. And what this does is it puts them in a very difficult situation. The Anti-Slavery Society was an abolitionist society in the North committed to abolishing slavery. It existed at the same time and shared membership with people in the women's reform movement. And the task students are given is, should they, as an anti-slavery society, support the Seneca Falls Convention and support the women's rights movement? And you can see in a teacher's notes as what students were saying as how they were struggling with that. If they recognized the women's group, it would hurt their movement. How do they reconcile those two needs? I know this lesson is difficult to read, this example. What it is this was developed by Ms. Connors and Mr. Agri in U.S. History 1. They asked students, who really freed the slaves? Was it Abraham Lincoln? Was it the Union Army? Or was it the slaves themselves? They split their students into teams, each tasked with proving one of those thesis points. And those students went out and found sources. They put together arguments that supported that thesis, and they put it into a common Google document, while teams of other students were tasked with specifically tearing those arguments apart. They looked at the resources. They looked at the websites used to create those arguments. They checked for their authenticity. They see if the evidence could be corroborated. They see if the logic used to support the claim is worthwhile. Mr. Agri and Ms. Connors presented this at the New Jersey Council for Social Studies conference at Rutgers last year, and it was very well received. This summer, we saw Confederate monuments being torn down across the South. 2 years ago, a 9th grade U.S. history teacher had students looking at material from the Southern Poverty Law Center that produced a timeline and a record of all the Confederate monuments, the schools, the parks, the street names that they were named after, and most importantly, when they were built. And then she gave those students an article from Facing History and Ourselves that focused on different ways to deal with Confederate monuments in New Orleans, a statement from the governor of Alabama, and Charlottesville, Virginia. In 2016, a documentary was made that put a connection between the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, and connected it with mass incarceration of African Americans today. Just in rough numbers, African Americans compose about 13% of our population, but 35 to 40% of the incarcerated population. Teachers connected this in a reconstruction unit that's taught after the Civil War. They came up with a permission slip for parents. They offered students an alternative assignment if their parents didn't want them to watch the film or if they didn't want to watch the film. And I bring your attention to the permission slip because it points directly to the conversations we're having now about equity in our district. And it's important to note that some students and some parents elected not to watch the film. In the late 19th century, the War Department and the Department of Interior took young men and women off Indian slaves, off Native American reservations, and brought them to schools in the East that they called industrial schools. They made them cut their hair. They made them change their clothes. They made them take different names. So students are exposed to that process through a reading. Then they read letters from these children, letters they wrote their father, things that they recorded in their diaries. And they engage that topic to see what it is that these students experienced. Some of these kids thought it was excellent for them. Some of them parents thought it as a way out for them. Others were horrified by it. So students will read those diaries and letters, maybe look at a UN definition of what ethnic cleansing is, and to see if this qualifies and meets that UN definition. That lesson ends with a TED Talk from Aaron Huey, who is a National Geographic photographer who did a photo essay of the Pine Ridge Reservation and what that looks like today. Almost half that population lives below the poverty level. The dropout rate is 70%. Is there a connection between the past and the present? Our teaching about African American history doesn't just focus on slavery. It focuses on the culture of African Americans within that experience in their past as it goes to the future. This lesson deals with the great migration of African Americans from the South to northern cities during and after World War I. And students are again looking at primary source documents. They're reading from Langston Hughes' poetry. They're looking at paintings by Jacob Lawrence. They might read a short excerpt from The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wickerson, or they'll look at articles from the Negro American magazine. This is a different way to deal with this topic. It's a silent conversation. Students walk around the room, read these pieces, and think about their first reaction, what they can infer, and how it relates to other experiences that they've been learning about. It happens silently first. They write on the primary source documents, and then that feeds a conversation afterwards. That course in U.S. History 2, we also have students analyzing the way in which immigrants are portrayed in political cartoons. This is the time when the United States expanded overseas. This is the time of the Spanish-American War, the acquisition of Hawaii, and at the same time, mass immigration. What are immigrants portrayed as in these cartoons? What does that say about the United States then, and what do we think it could say about us now? A standard U.S. History 2 lesson deals with the rise of suburbia. Maybe you'll have a few clips from Leave It to Beaver, you'll watch a little bit of I Love Lucy, you'll talk about conformity, maybe you'll read the poem Little Boxes, but that's the way history has been taught for years, ignoring some of the primary source evidence and what happened during that same period. This is a document-based lesson, and I'm drawing your attention to the primary sources that are used for this and some of the secondary resources used for this. There's a digitization project out of the University of Richmond through their digital science project where they mapped out what the home loan corporation did during the Great Depression. They sent people out to individual neighborhoods to interview people, to check the composition of neighborhoods in order to provide that information to banks so they can finance loans. And you'll see within those documents how certain neighborhoods in inner cities were redlined. We'll look at the underwriting manual from the Federal Housing Authority in 1940 that said specifically they will only guarantee mortgages for neighborhoods that are racially consistent. We'll read deeds from Levittown that had restrictive covenants that said you can buy this house, but you can't sell it to black people. We have a U.S. History 2 unit on the Civil Rights Movement. This is just some of the choices that we're making. And I want to point out here, I guess, also, is that just like I'm taking too much of your time tonight to try to show you all of this, a U.S. History 1 teacher and a U.S. History 2 teacher in a normal year, pre-COVID, has 136 classes. What are they going to include? When they're looking at their 7 classes to teach the Civil Rights Movement, they're going to have to make a decision about that documentary from Eyes on the Prize. The one that we show most often is the Freedom Riders. Because of the interviews, because of the archival film, it seems to be a powerful message. The Emmett Till lesson might be more effective this year than last year because they finally replaced the sign commemorating him. They had to replace it with a bulletproof sign because it gets shot up every year. Just last year, also during the remote learning, a teacher offered students an alternative reading if they wanted to explore it. And it's from Michael Bronsky's excerpt of Queer History of the United States, and it deals with the way in which the AIDS crisis manifests itself in the United States in the early 1980s. This is one of those lessons that it might be in our catalog, but if we're in the middle of a pandemic, it's going to move to the front of the list because it allows students to understand the present to see through looking the way it was handled in the past. After George Floyd, several teachers began to modify their instruction to help students understand it. The example on the right is from sociology, and it's a section from a book called Savage Inequalities that deals with school segregation. And the teacher was asking students, do they notice this in New Jersey, and if they think it exists. The example on the left is from a NewJersey.com article that talks about the study from the New Jersey Law Center and the Civil Rights Project of the University of California in Los Angeles. Their updated report that said that the population of schools in New Jersey that are less than 1% white have almost doubled, from 4.8 to 8.3% of the schools in New Jersey. So this teacher was exposing students to the issue of segregation in schools right in New Jersey. Other teachers wanted to take what students have been learning throughout the year and make it actionable in terms of what was happening in our public discourse after the murder of George Floyd. What you see is a list of sources that students were exposed to look through and see if they could research the person who said it and find out something in their past. What is it that gives this person the perspective? What factors shape their point of view? Instead of just letting students be exposed to this language, the teachers thought it was a better task to have them get exposed to it and then discuss it in a classroom, in an open space with an academic eye. There are lessons outside of the classroom in this area as well. You're well aware of the Attorney General's visit to our school last year, just before we broke for the pandemic. But we also had students from the Holocaust and Genocide Studies class visit Temple Sinai and Summit. They have a Holocaust Remembrance Center. And the reason that this is effective is because what that center includes is artifacts from their own members. It's their parents, it's their grandparents, it's their aunts. And when we walked through that center with the guides that we had, they were talking about people they knew. They were talking about their family. And that ended with a talk from Susan Lederman, who is one of the hidden children and a Holocaust survivor. At the end of last year also, with the events of the shutdown of the schools and with George Floyd and massive protests and the Black Lives Matter movement, we thought that students needed to have an experience of being able to talk about this with their teachers. So we sent an open invitation out to the entire body of the high school, and we had 6 or 8 teachers in a Google Meet, and we talked about whatever they wanted to talk about. And we had 3 meetings. The first one was attended by about 30 students. The second and the third maybe had less, and you really had membership from the first meeting. But the first one went on for more than an hour and a half. And the discussion went from the past to the present, what people were learning and what they were understanding through the whole episode. I want to close with just a couple of our projects in professional development. This is from 2 years ago. The content leader in K3 used materials from Teaching Tolerance to work with teachers to find the best readings and lessons to deal with bullying, bias, class, immigration, race, and ethnicity. That was part of our Go Time professional development. Those teachers got together about 4 or 5 times and shared their lessons. In November of 2019, 4th and 5th grade teachers went through a professional development workshop that was organized around the Teaching Tolerance program of teaching hard history and dealing with their framework for teaching history. It is working towards that process of providing teachers with the tools and strategies they need to teach these topics that are so difficult. In January, we've partnered with Teaching Tolerance. We're going to have a professional development workshop. We're going to work with some of their professionals, with teachers from 6th grade through 12th grade. And we're going to go through this program about facilitating critical conversations with students. One of the difficulties that we have, one of the areas that we have to work in, is trying to figure out how we can have these conversations that are difficult to have. The ones that are awkward, the ones that put us in defensive modes because they are difficult. In closing, I just wanted to say that I wanted to thank you for your attention, your patient attention. We are educating the first generation of students to come of age after the murder of George Floyd. And when we look to this generation, perhaps we can look to them as our parents look to us. And maybe they will do a little better and move this country a little closer to the ideals than we did. Thank you.
Mike, did you want to say something before we?
No, just to thank you very much, Steve, for taking the time to put together that presentation, which was exhaustive. As you can see, Steve, he eats it and drinks it, or sleeps it and lives it, or whatever you want to call it. He, from the first day I met him, I've known him to be someone who just loves history, loves everything about history, and loves getting into the inside of it. So I'm sure he's happy to answer any questions that anyone might have and elaborate on anything that catches your eye, or go off on something else that maybe wasn't in the presentation.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Steve. If you don't mind, I'd just like to start and then pass it over to the rest of the folks. You had mentioned, just like Mrs. Rocco mentioned, the curriculum has changed quite a bit over the decades, and some of the students that graduated maybe last year didn't have some of the things that are taught in K-3 now. And that's always going to be evolving, if we're doing our job properly. But my question is, you mentioned that you used to offer a course at the high school, and again, it's a building block, right? K-3, you're introducing certain elements and teaching the kids about themselves and their culture. In 4 and 5, you get a little deeper. Middle school, you get deeper still, and then in the high school is where the rubber hits the road, and there's some really deep conversations and maybe some tolerance and biases. Now, you had mentioned that the one particular course, I think you said it was Black History, the enrollment was dwindling, and then we offered additional AP courses. Given the new landscape, how do we do a better job of offering courses that the students are interested in, that confront these biases, and that, we only have 47 classrooms, we only have so many hours in the day, we only have so many teachers. People are going to say, nope, don't take away any AP courses, don't do that. So how do we make this puzzle work? Can we utilize some of the technology that we've been forced into using? Can we offer students maybe virtual classes that go beyond the physical brick and mortar? But the one thing that I really want to ask you is, how do we connect these fantastic lessons that these students have been exposed to over the years and maybe get them to absorb it more? Do we need to be more deliberate in the labeling? This is to talk about, racism, sexism, ageism, sizeism. It's some of the lessons, you talk about slavery and you put up the nice picture of the airplane. How do we get students to remember or connect the dots that, oh, I did learn about this. Oh, I was exposed to this. Oh, we did have a conversation about that, but it was really about something else. No. It was exactly about racism. It was about tolerance. It was about the economic struggle. So, as the expert, how do we do a better job of having the students learn what's being taught?
3 things come to my mind as you ask that question. And the first of which is the challenge of getting students to have for want of a better word, an intimate relationship with the experience of others outside of the world that they live in. It seems too simple to think about this is someone on the other side of a screen, this was someone in a book, and they know no one who is in that situation. So part of it is in what ways can we make that connection closer? And are there ways that we can have them get into conversations with people who have different experiences? Part of it is the struggle of exposing them to a world in a way that they can really understand that they have no experience in, nor does anyone they know have any experience in. The second part of the puzzle, I think, deals with the fact that nothing that we teach is in a vacuum. That they have their teacher's understanding of history, the stuff that they might see that they're scrolling through on TikTok, and the stuff that their parents talk about or something that's in movies that they see or a documentary that they see. The history itself that we teach doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's influenced by all those other pieces. So one of the challenges I think we have as it relates to the way we teach is that students are going through school with a very utilitarian notion. And I want to say all students, I want to say that it's a generally accepted idea that this is a means to an end. And what I have to do in this class is what the teacher tells me to do and what I need to do to get a certain grade and to move on in a certain path in life. And it's the security that they see in that path, that if they follow that path, if they do what's told, if they get these grades, if they answer the way they're supposed to, then they will achieve security in their life, either through a college acceptance or through a path into a career that they can be successful in. So part of the difficulty is breaking that mode, at the same time recognizing the reality of that mode. So that is difficult. On a much more practical level, the third thing I would think about is just in terms of what's in our course offerings and what's available to students. Because part of it will deal with, well, this course isn't going to help me get into this school, but this course will. We have a number of those elective courses. There's certainly something, I know we've talked about it among teachers, do we start to cycle others in? And it would have to fit, I would think, somewhere in that cycle. Do we take Middle Eastern studies out? What do we do with international studies? There's about 4 or 5 that come in and out based on student interest. But in the early 20-teens, law and society got really popular, and then the APs were introduced, which made that decision a lot more difficult for students choosing courses.
Does anybody else have any comments? Mike, did you have?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Great presentation. I really enjoyed that. I have a couple of questions. In terms of what wasn't there, that I was kind of looking to see, where do we, and you might do this presentation was about a specific topic, but where do we introduce students to concepts like extremism, whether it be religious extremism or economic extremism, where we talk about the different economic theories like communism and socialism and capitalism.
In terms of the last part of your question first, in terms of economic systems,
Yeah.
one of the problems we have with teaching that is the inapplicability of those terms to reality, meaning that whenever you apply the term or whenever they hear it in current events or in just general media as to what socialism is, then we get into the idea of what qualifies as that, what are the qualities of that and how it is defined.
I mention that because we hear it almost every day.
Yes,
now, right?
yeah. That shows up in 8th grade with different economic systems. That's probably the first time that they approach it. They see extremism with terrorism and current events in 7th grade. Where it's explored the most probably is in world studies in 11th grade, because that deals with the different ways of approaching religion with fundamentalism and deals with the idea of following an ideology very closely. And that's where extremism can surface, though we deal with extremism across in other areas as well throughout that course. So I would say those are the places that would show up.
Okay. And one other thing that I noticed in the presentation was you mentioned that the students were able to identify the holdings of the Bank of the United States, which may be attributed to the economics of slavery. What do we teach about that? Is that to determine what reparations may look like at some point? Or what's the purpose of that?
That's a really good question, and I'm glad that you asked it because it allows me to more fully explain the process of teaching. It's not like we are saying, okay, this is the percentage of banks of the percentage of the holdings of the Bank of the United States, and therefore X, Y, or Z. What we're doing is, that's why we frame it within the idea of teaching them to read, write, and reason within the discipline of history. That concept and that knowledge has really surfaced only recently. Part of it is through the work of Edward Baptist and The Half That Wasn't Told, and his book where he begins to go into the details of that. There's also work being done with Tulane and looking at the individual sale prices of slaves and the amount of money generated in that. But of course, that also covers what's happening in the Northeast and with shipping companies, insurance companies, and stocks and mortgages. So what we're doing is just saying to students, this is the material that's out there. This is what's being said. This is different from what's been said in the past. Does this history give us a better understanding of the past? And is it valid? Where else do we see other historians mentioning this process? What sort of the sources that are used? Is it reliable? Does it corroborate? And what better understanding of that past helps us understand our present? We never have a lesson that really deals with, does this mean we do something as a result of it? It's really for a better understanding.
Thank you.
Any additional comments? You're still the chair of curriculum, correct? If you don't mind, Steve, I'd like to maybe tee up on future curriculum meetings, maybe drill a little further into that concept of utilitarian. I think that's a huge challenge here. Kids want to take as many AP courses as they can, or do what they can to get through a course to get the grade they need to, get into a particular program. So I think that challenge that you mentioned is something that we need to work on, and maybe the material's not being absorbed as much as we'd like. And I know Dr. LaSousa has talked at length that he'd like to get rid of grades altogether, and that would help with that. But again, as soon as, Cornell gets rid of their grading system, we'll fall right behind that. So it's not realistic to think, okay, we can't grade, but it seems to be getting in the way of some of these fantastic messages also being received. And I don't know how we can do this in the middle of a pandemic, but when the AG spoke, that was a wildly powerful presentation for students to hear his background, his struggles, what his cultural expectations were, and what he, chose to do with his life. I don't know if we can introduce more public speaking, if it's virtual, through TED Talks. When the pandemic's over, bring some of those speakers in, but I think that maybe we can, if we'd like to tap your brain, how do you think we can utilize some of that technology as well to expose our students to speakers from other parts of the world, the country, to expose them to some additional struggles that they were like, who knew that was even going on? So I'm punting that to Lotta, definitely. I'm good at delegating. Dr. LaSousa?
That's it. Thank you again, Steve, and that's it for my report.
Thank you, Steve. We won't be offended if, I know you're on your 18th hour of your day, so we won't be offended if you head home. So we're going to move back to the regular agenda. Dr. LaSousa, you are done, correct? I know you said that was it. Last opportunity, very good, thumbs up. So we're going to move over to the business administrator's report. I'd like to welcome Tatiana Gilbert, who's the assistant VA. She helps the magic happen behind the scenes. You often don't see her, but Mr. DeCrolls has a conflict, so Tatiana's filling in. So welcome aboard.
Thanks, Joe. As far as the construction update, the lighting contractor at the CMS auditorium is working on the final punch list items.
Could you put your mic a little closer? Sorry,
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if it's coming
Sorry.
through.
I'll repeat that. The lighting contractor at the CMS auditorium is working on the final punch list items. The testing is being coordinated with the performing arts supervisor. And for the second item on the agenda, the bus evacuation drills happened as specified on the agenda.
And I'm sorry if you said it and I didn't hear it, I apologize. On the construction updates,
Sure.
can you just remind us what's still outstanding if you know? If not, I could bug Peter.
I'm going to defer to Peter on that one.
Okay, that's
for the
very
next
good.
meeting.
Okay. Again, the topic that was hot when last we met was the middle school auditorium. The warranties lapse in March. We have yet to do a presentation there, so we don't know really if we've kicked the can enough, kick the tires. I just want to see where we stand on that. Again, I don't want to get to March and say, oh gosh, this doesn't work or that doesn't work, and you're just out of warranty. The pandemic hit and we've had no presentations in there. Does anybody have any questions for Tatiana? She loves questions, loves the public speak. Nothing? Okay. All righty, moving on to committee reports. Ms. Ciccarelli is not available tonight, so in personnel, we talked about some personnel updates. We also talked about what's called Chapter 44, which is changes to the health insurance laws and how it affects teachers and how much they contribute, and also the school district and how much they contribute. That's still being worked out. We don't really know how that's going to fall, but it will definitely impact, starting in January of 2020. So we're still working that through. Matt, I don't know if you had anything more on that particular item from a finance, no? Okay. I just wanted to double check because I wasn't in finance. Curriculum, Ms. Kenny? Don't mind.
Curriculum did meet after speaking with the Director of Technology and the Supervisor of Design and Technology. There was a need that was identified to further support the teachers at the secondary level. And as such, a management system for field and concerns and issues will be created and to guide the type to help the support staff as it relates to the area of technology. And these positions will be reporting into Daniel Lagunas. Secondly, Ms. Chase is working with the K-5 elementary principals and math content leaders with the absence of Ms. Winters, and they're going to be overseeing the mathematics at the elementary level, and Mr. Sean Devon is going to be providing similar support for grades 6 to 12. And lastly, we just spoke about the college application process during this hybrid model for CHS, and we're going to be getting an update at our next meeting.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions for Lotta or anybody else on the curriculum? The technology changes are probably just the first of many as we evolve in the virtual delivery of instruction. I'm sure we'll be adding to that as time goes on and as we learn more and the tools evolve. Finance and facilities, Mr. Gilfillan?
We did meet, and I'm liking a lot of, have you guys remember how much we talked about, because I don't have my cheat sheet with me. I did know we had the follow-up conversations on the athletic and transportation issues that we just decided to keep on as we were going. We talked about the state funding and the fact, much surprise to me, it's actually been 100% in line to date. They haven't lapsed on any payment, so we've been pretty good that far. Do you guys remember else we spoke about?
The healthcare change.
A lot about the healthcare. We have no idea where that's going to shake out. With the, all right, Mike, you got the nod in this one. The one big issue was, the state plan and the agreement that they made and how that could potentially impact us. But we don't know if is it 100% set in stone?
We're still working through that and have an open enrollment in progress now.
So it's not worth espousing about until we know 100% what's going on with that. I think that was mostly with the healthcare side, right? Yeah. Thank you for that, Matt.
Thank you, Matt. And then moving over finally to policy and planning, Mr. Ryan.
Yeah, we met last week. We also discussed and approved winter sports transportation for hockey and swimming. We discussed recreation use of the facilities during COVID. We talked about a non-resident student issue and paraprofessional support for after-school programs should they become necessary. And we also discussed Thanksgiving and the holiday season and whether or not we were going to change some scheduling, but nothing's been decided. Okay. Thanks.
On the sports one, are we doing similar to in the winter sports where it's prorated if the NJSIA shuts us down. Right now, winter sports are going forward, correct?
Correct. On both counts, yep.
Modified. But the way we're doing the contract is similar to the fall? Okay. Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Ryan or anybody else on policy and planning? Excellent. No. Are there any liaison reports? Matt, can you? There's a lot of boards.
I do have an update for CEF. The 8th annual trivia night is going virtual. If you want to get your team together of family and friends, the registration is open until November 10th, and any team registering before November 5th will get a 10-point head start in the event. You can register on the website. Secondly, CEF is presenting a town hall with Dr. Sousa on Wednesday, November 11th at 7:30 via Zoom. Superintendent Sousa will provide an update on our district's priorities, the outlook ahead for managing the winter months, and the status of our hybrid approach. Questions are welcome in advance, and you may include your question in the form online. If time permits, additional questions may be asked in the chat during the event. And 'tis the season to drink wine. I don't know if that could happen all year round. Main Street Wine Cellars will donate 10% back to Chatham Education Foundation when you buy one or more of a specific bottles of wine. And you can actually get 20% off the listed price when you buy 12 or more. So pop a quote to CEF and help fund the grants for the Chatham School District.
Thanks, Lada. So the trivia night's going to be virtual? Trivia night will be a virtual night?
Trivia night will be virtual, and it will be G-rated, so you can do it with your family as well.
I might actually have a chance if I can Google the questions and the answers this year. Alrighty, excellent. Any other questions or comments on the liaison reports? Okay, we're going to move over. I just want to make a motion to pass the minutes of the October 12th public and executive session. And I believe, Bradley, you weren't here last time? And I think Sal, correct? Are those the only two absents? No. Brad and Mike. Why I'm questioning, do we have enough to pass it? 1, 2, 3, 4.
No, I was not at the last board.
That's if I vote in favor of it. Okay. All those in favor on this right side of me? Opposed? Abstentions? There we go.
Motion passes 402.
If we need to pass it again because we didn't have the right subset of people, just let us know at the next meeting and we'll bring it up again. Okay, very good. So we have our first opportunity for public commentary. Hearing of the citizens during public commentary section. The agenda is an opportunity for any member of the public to be heard about issues which are or are not topics on the agenda at the current meeting. To help facilitate an orderly meeting, permit all to be heard, speakers are asked to limit their comments to a reasonable length of time. If you wouldn't mind, if you could introduce yourself. And again, just a reminder, this is your opportunity to provide comments, but it will not be a Q&A. So this is your time. You have the floor. Hello, Aunt Jane.
Good evening. Jane Devlin, Aunt Jane. I'm glad to be here this evening. I wanted to thank Mr. Mayor for, at the beginning of his presentation, validating and affirming the students' genuine interest in histories, plural, in racial issues, and in social injustice, and seeing them as being truly inquisitive and sincerely interested in being change agents, that they want to challenge their minds and challenge the status quo in order to better lives as individuals and better society. So again, thank you for affirming those students. They don't want to be disruptors for simply disruption's sake. I think it's significant to learn here tonight and understand how much the social studies curriculum has changed, even in a few years, since some of our outspoken alumni were pupils of social studies. And I think it's significant, too, how open the school district of the Chatham Social Studies Department is to ongoing reevaluation of materials and to continually enriching what was taught or what is taught in the schools. The students were and are correct. Some things they brought forth as concerns, they in fact did not learn here at CHS or in the school district of the Chathams. But it is evident to me, at least, that the CHS, the school district of the Chathams, hopefully the Chatham community, and hopefully our society at large, is ever-changing, evolving, and hopefully we are on a better path to empathy and dismantling of social and systemic injustices and racial inequalities or inequities. So again, I think this was a very meaningful exchange, at least speaking for myself, to have a broad and enhanced understanding on what is being done and continues to be done through the school district of the Chathams to equip our children as critical thinkers and to ready them for the world ahead. So I just again want to thank the Social Studies Department, the Board of Education, and the School District of the Chathams administration. Thank you.
Bill Heap, Chatham Borough. It's getting late, so I'll be quick. First, I thought the discussion on the plague was very good. You talked about some of the problems that we are going to face in the future, and it's not going to be very easy. My bias is toward keeping schools open, and so far you are to be congratulated for doing a magnificent job. There are no magic bullets in this. Life is not without risk, and we are going to have to move ahead. That doesn't mean we have to be stupid about it, but I think that as long as we can stay in school and keep the schools open, we are much better off. Second thing tonight is I'm going to put on my JC hat and talk Christmas trees. It appears that the state of Pennsylvania holds the fate of the election in their hands. And somehow they have also managed to corner the market on Christmas trees. I spoke last year of a shortage, and it's been developing over the past couple of years, and this year it has really hit home. We have only managed to fill about 3/4 of our usual order. And on a wholesale level, there isn't a Fraser fir or a Douglas fir to be had in the entire state of Pennsylvania. So, prices will be going up. We are the middleman. We have nothing much to say about that. This has been going on for some time and for numerous reasons. Lack of planting after the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Let's blame Goldman Sachs for that. The fact that most tree farmers are somewhere between the age of 70 and dead. Young people don't seem to want to come into the industry. It's backbreaking work. And it appears that civilization is encroaching deep into Pennsylvania because it's easier to sell your acreage to Home Depot than to plant trees. So, get out and get your tree early. We expect to be open sometime Friday after Thanksgiving. We're going to open earlier this year, and it's entirely an outdoor event, so people will be safe, and we hope to provide a little bit of joy for what promises to be, let's say, an interesting winter. So please, it's a community event. This is our 53rd tree sale. We will have all the usual suspects there, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the Key Club helping us out, and we would appreciate your patronage. Thanks. Okay.
Joe Bazaralian, Fairfax Terrace. I just wanted to thank Mr. Mayor for the presentation. Thought it was very helpful. I did think of, well, let me start here. How to create in students a desire to learn and dig and think critically. I really heard that coming through as a goal of the social studies curriculum. So much of that is how to get the students, how interesting does the teacher render the subject matter? And I thought that some of the examples that Mr. Mayor showed is exactly what moves the curriculum in that direction. How probably everybody in this room, maybe not everybody, because I never said it to my parents when I was in high school, because I was a little bit of a freak, was it's something in school is boring. So how to make it less boring is what it sounded like Mr. Mayor's presentation was going for, to depict the tensions, the fairness and unfairness, the justice and injustice, the strivings, the achievements, but the crushing disappointments throughout the fiber of all throughout American history and world history. This isn't, those things aren't episodic. So it's good that, we highlight certain junctures of American history, but the closer we can get to making every day throughout the social studies curriculum, giving students and teachers the material to show that every day of American life, there are life and death struggles going on over fairness and unfairness, equality and inequality, power, justice, and exploitation of power and pushback. The more that the social studies curriculum keeps pushing in that direction, the more attached I really believe our kids, all the students, will be. The less they'll be obsessed with making that grade, and the more they'll be inherently interested, because in their own lives, in their own minds, as we all know, there is this drama. There is this excitement. There are life and death struggles in their mind of what's going on in their school and their life. The more they can see that that is what our history is through the materials and through the curriculum evolving, the better off will be not only our students and making, but also our society. So I do appreciate, and I listen with incredible interest to the presentation, and my encouragement would be keep pushing. We know how hard it is to do, but you have, I think, the support of so many people, and definitely me, to keep pushing in the direction that it's clear that it seems like you and the district have been going. So I didn't have that pre-prepared, so I hope the overall theme came across. But I think it seems like we're going in the right direction. You have, and I hope we can keep doing it. And whatever materials, resources that you need, I hope you're just outspoken with Dr. L'Souza and the board and the public about what you need to allow this evolution to keep going. It's so important. So thank you for the time, and thank you again for that presentation.
Thank you, Joe. Any additional public commentary? No. Okay, seeing none. We're going to move on to the regular agenda. Starting with personnel, I will move that in Ann's absence. So I'd like to move action items A1 through 11 on the regular agenda, and 12 to 14 on the addendum. That's it right there.
Second.
Any questions or comments on the personnel? Not that we can question or comment too much. Mike, you have nothing? Tatiana, do you mind?
Yep. Noted for the record that agenda items A1 through A11 and addendum items A12 through 14 pass 6-0.
You can vote.
No, just,
Oh, I'm so sorry.
no, that's all right. This is, we're doing this just to torment you. So
Go for it.
I'll just drive from here. So all those in favor of the personnel items?
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye. In favor. In favor.
And I'm going to abstain.
Go ahead.
A little ahead of ourselves. So moving over to finance and facilities, Matt, would you mind?
5-0.
Second.
And I did have a question, Tatiana, on the COVID. Somebody, you seconded it, right, Brad?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Yes.
On the number that we're getting back, I think it's $106,000.
Yes.
And that's from a grant
Yes.
for
So
COVID relief?
the state of New Jersey gave an allocation to districts, letting them know how much we were getting. So our allocation was at $106,751 to help defer the costs related to the pandemic.
Okay, now can we expect, I mean, we've spent considerably more than that in COVID or preparation expenses. Can we expect additional funding to come our way? Do you have any anticipation of what will be, I know you're keeping track of it diligently.
Yes.
If we spent $300,000, is there an expectation that we'll receive 100% of that back, 50% of it back?
I don't have an exact figure for you, but there has been different sources of these grants for us for coronavirus. So we have this from the state. We also had the digital divide, for example, which was to help with one-on-one devices. So we got $28,000 with that. We got the non-Title I CARES funding, which we got about $72,000. And we do still have to submit some expenses to FEMA, and we're hoping to get a 75% reimbursement rate on that, depending on what they determine is eligible.
Okay. So, I mean, do you think if we can achieve 75%, that would be a win, or do you?
That would be a win, I think.
Okay, so it's not likely we'd get 100% of our expendidures back.
I don't want to be overly optimistic.
Understood. I just
but
want to be.
It could be.
Yeah,
better
just
than
trying to be
75%.
realistic. If 75% is the an achievable goal. Mr.
That's
Ryan?
only the FEMA fund, though.
Right, just for FEMA.
So on top of the FEMA of the 75%, you have these other, grants that might get us closer to, and I'm going to say 90% conservatively,
Okay. All right, well, keep plugging away and looking to get any of those dollars back.
I will get you all that I can.
I appreciate it, thank you. And if you wouldn't mind, Tatiana, the answer that you just gave me, can you just put some of those figures into the minutes?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Not that we're going to hold your feet to the fire on them, I just kind of want them there on the record that we did receive $106,000 back. In other avenues that we might be able to achieve some reimbursement.
No problem.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions on the financial facilities item? For Matt? Okay, no, seeing none, okay. All those in favor? Opposed? Abstentions?
Noted for the record, the motion passes 6-0.
Excellent, thank you. Moving over to curriculum, Ms. Kenny? I don't think that got picked up on the mic, but Lotta moved action items C1 through C2. Mr. Gilfillan seconded. Any questions on the curriculum? I don't think we can have too deep a conversation on those. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions?
Noted for the record, it passes 6-0.
Excellent. Then, Mr. Ryan, bring us home with policy and procedures.
I would like to move agenda item D1 on the regular agenda for a vote.
I'll second that. And Mike, those are mostly Strauss Esmes?
Yeah, so what we started to do, and hopefully we can continue to do this, Amanda, if you look in the policy committee folder on the drive, it has the agenda for the last meeting, and it has all of these policies listed and the changes that were made to each one in bullet points. So any member of the board can go in and read them. I read all the policies. I'm not sure if everyone does, but it has literally has bullets now to tell you what the changes were.
Okay, perfect.
It's really helpful.
Perfect, thank you. Does anybody have any additional questions for Mike on policy and procedures? No?
These are all first reading, right, Mike?
Yeah. First reading.
Right.
Okay, all those in favor?
All right.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay.
Noted for the record that the motion passes 6-0.
Sure. Excellent, thank you. So we now have our opportunity for board business. Mike, did you have something? I see you chomping at the, no, you don't, okay. I'm just curious, Mike, you had mentioned something last week about the calendar. Right now, we're forging ahead. We're not closing for Thanksgiving. We're not closing for 2 weeks after, unless the landscape changes. Correct. Right now, we're...
Yes, I think that's accurate.
Okay.
There's a nearby district who made the decision to close on about December 19th, if that's the Monday of that week, and remain closed all of that week and then 2 additional weeks. So the week of Christmas and New Year's, and then a week after that, in order to give people time to travel, if they were going to travel and get together with family at that time, hoping that they would hold off on the Thanksgiving holiday. But that's the only district I'm aware of that altered their calendar so far to try to, kind of contain the spillover that might happen from families getting together or people traveling to other states to visit family. So as of now, our plan is to remain open as long as we can.
Does anybody else have any board business they'd like to bring up, new or old? No. Okay. We have our second opportunity for public commentary. I don't think there's anybody else new left in the room. Oh. Mr. He put it up. Bill,
all right, well.
Can you put the microphone down a little bit lower?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. My name is Hannah Wetter. I'm a Chatham alumni from 2019. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate you giving us this snapshot, and I learned a lot about social studies instruction tonight, so thank you very much. I appreciated the fact that you are holding professional development workshops from Disrupt Texts, which was mentioned last meeting for ELA, as well as teaching tolerance for the social studies department. I'll also note that this is different from anti-racism training for students and teachers, which is offered by organizations like EduSage Companion Counseling, if you wanted to look into that further. And I think further incorporating anti-racist texts is very important, and I'm glad that you highlighted those that already exist, but it's always good to add more, and like Joe said earlier, pushing further is very important. So, and I also appreciate you highlighting recent teachers' efforts to that are kind of improvised, but to educate on where, why, and how racism exists in Chatham, New Jersey, and the United States, both presently and historically. So I hope those teachings are uplifted and expanded upon in future kind of reform. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Any additional comments? No? Okay, seeing none, we do not have an executive session, so I make a motion to close the meeting. Everybody's in